Good evening, my friends. Imagine this. You're walking down an alley in Chang'an City during the Tang Dynasty. On both sides are dusty, pounded earth walls, and the air carries a scent mixed with donkey dung and flatbread. You'd only stepped out to buy a flatbread, but as you turned a corner, two bailiffs in kung fu attire blocked your path. You are Zhang San. No, I'm Li Si. Even better, we're looking for Li Si too. And then you were carried off. Now, dim the lights, and to the accompaniment of bells and pipes, let's enter tonight's story. You were led, arms clamped by the bailiffs, your toes dragging on the ground, through the county yaman's side gate, past the main hall, to a heavy wooden door. The door was clad in iron, the rivets on the iron like black pockmarks. The bailiffs pushed hard, and the door's hinge groaned a long, drawn-out sound, like an old ox at its death. Behind the door was a narrow passageway, with high walls on both sides, and above, only a thin sliver of sky was visible. This sliver of sky looked as if it had been cut by a knife, so narrow it made your heart anxious. This was the entrance to the prison cell area. In the Tang Dynasty, county-level prisons were typically located in a corner of the county yaman's backyard, not large, but sufficient to hold all the prisoners awaiting trial in that county. You were pushed forward. The air carried the scent of damp straw, combined with the smell of unwashed human bodies that hadn't bathed for who knows how many days. This smell had a peculiar penetrative power. It didn't hit you all at once, but rather seeped subtly, layer by layer, into your nasal passages, and by the time you realized it, it had already settled in. You instinctively covered your nose with your sleeve. The bailiff escorting you glanced at you sidelong and said, "Just get used to it. In a couple of days you won't smell it anymore." You were led to a cell at the end of the corridor. The bailiff opened the barred door. You ducked your head, stepped over the threshold, and walked in. Your first reaction was darkness. The cell walls were pounded earth, with only a palm-sized window near the ceiling, letting in pitifully little light. It took your eyes several minutes to adjust. Then you began to make out the full extent of the room, roughly 10 square meters. The floor was covered with a layer of straw, already yellowed and blackened. It gave off a damp smell, somewhere between mildew and straw. In the corner was a pottery jar, the communal latrine for everyone. There were also one or two water bowls in the corner, with suspicious dark stains along their rims. The room already had occupants. When you entered, 3 or 4 people lifted their heads from the straw pile, glanced at you, then lowered their heads again, like a group of old cats whose nap had been disturbed. Their faces weren't good. They had the grayish-white pallor that comes from spending too long in places with insufficient sunlight. The person furthest inside looked the oldest, with a scraggly beard, sitting cross-legged and picking his teeth with a blade of straw. The younger one near the door had bright eyes and scrutinized you several times, seemingly assessing what kind of character you were. Another person sat in a corner, back to everyone, unmoving. You weren't even sure if he was asleep or awake. There was a subtle tension in the air, not hostility, but more like animals that had already established an order within a cage. Suddenly, a new one was thrown in, and everyone needed a little time to recalibrate their positions. Ancient prison conditions varied greatly across different dynasties and regions, but a few common characteristics were almost always present. Dark, damp, crowded. Darkness was for security. Larger windows made it easier for prisoners to escape, so if they could avoid opening one, they did. Dampness was because cells were often built in low-lying areas, some even semi-underground, with ground moisture constantly rising throughout the year. Crowding was due to limited ancient local finances. It was impossible to give every prisoner a single cell. A 10-square-meter cell housing 4 or 5 people was considered lenient. In major cases, when a whole group was arrested, having 7 or 8 people wasn't uncommon. The orientation of the cells also had its considerations. Many prisons were deliberately built with cells facing north, not for feng shui, but because north-facing rooms received no sunlight year-round, resulting in lower temperatures. Prisoners were less likely to cause trouble due to stuffiness and heat. In some cities during the Song Dynasty, prison cells actually had different grades. The worst conditions were in what were called death cells or black cells, like the one you're currently in, dark, without daylight, and terrible conditions. Those with slightly better conditions had windows, somewhat cleaner straw, and perhaps even a simple wooden plank bed. Which cell you could stay in largely depended not on the crime you committed, but on how much money you or your family were willing to pay. You found a corner and sat down. The straw beneath your butt creaked, and a musty, old smell wafted up with it. Leaning against the cold, pounded earth wall, you began to size up your fellow inmates. They too were sizing you up. A subtle atmosphere, like that between animals meeting for the first time, permeated the cell. No one spoke to you first, and you didn't initiate conversation either. In prison, silence was the default state for newcomers. You didn't yet understand the rules here, didn't know the people, and any rash words could potentially step on a landmine. So you just sat there, listening to your own breathing become remarkably clear in the quiet cell. The pottery jar in the corner emitted a smell you tried to ignore but couldn't. Through the gaps in the bars of your door, you could see a few figures moving about in the cell across the corridor. You were still adjusting to the cell's light and smells. A voice came from outside the bars. "Newcomer, come here." You looked up. A man in a gray cloth tunic stood outside the barred door, jangling a set of keys in his hand. His face held an expression you'd find hard to describe, not fierce, not indifferent, but a sense of weariness. He was your jailer. Jailers were low-ranking bailiffs of the Yamen, with pitifully meager wages. A regular bailiff's monthly income in the Tang dynasty was probably only enough to afford a few decent meals in Chang'an City. But this job offered enormous opportunities for illicit gains. The logic was simple. Prisoners in jail needed food, water, straw bedding, access to a chamber pot, and to receive items from family. The fulfillment of all these daily needs had to pass through the jailer's hands. And in this process, every single step could be priced. You wanted a sip of clean water? Pay up. You wanted to change to a fresh, mold-free straw mat? Pay up. Your family sent a padded jacket. You wanted it brought in? Pay up. You needed to use the chamber pot once today? Pay up. From the Han dynasty all the way to the Qing dynasty, almost every dynasty saw officials memorializing the throne, fiercely condemning the issues of jailers seeking illicit gains, mistreating prisoners, and extortion. Liu Zongyuan of the Tang dynasty wrote an essay specifically criticizing this phenomenon. Bao Zheng of the Song dynasty is said to have also handled similar cases. But criticism aside, this problem largely remained unresolved for thousands of years. The reason was also very practical. The imperial court paid jailers too little. If you didn't let them squeeze some profit from prisoners, who would do this dirty, exhausting, and unlucky job for you? This meant that whether or not you had copper coins in your pocket directly determined your quality of life in this cell. Wealthy individuals, even if their time in jail wasn't pleasant, could at least eat a hot meal and sleep in a somewhat dry spot. He would bring you your porridge tonight, then turn and leave. The keys jangling at his waist, you would soon discover that the group of jailers wasn't a monolithic block. Some jailers simply treated it as a job. Take the money, do the work, no unnecessary talk, and no deliberate trouble for you. Others were different. They enjoyed the feeling that came with such power. You needed his nod to drink water, his permission to ask for more straw, and items from your family had to pass through his hands. In a normal world, these were trivial matters, but in a prison cell, they were magnified into life and death issues, and the person controlling these small things became the most powerful being in your world. In the evening, a young bailiff walked down the corridor carrying a wooden tray. He paused at the entrance of each cell, took a bowl of something from the tray, and passed it through the bars. When it was your cell's turn, you glanced over. A bowl of grayish-white porridge, so thin it could reflect your face, with a few suspiciously colored grains of rice floating on top, and a small, dark, lumpy thing beside it, probably a biscuit. Ancient prison food was just enough to keep you from starving to death. However, legal statutes in many dynasties actually had clear regulations regarding prisoners' meals. The Tang dynasty system stipulated that detained prisoners could receive a certain amount of grain daily, roughly 60 to 70% of what an average adult required. The Song dynasty was even more detailed. During the Northern Song period, there was a clear regulation that prisoners' rations were primarily rice or vegetarian food, about 1 sheng per person per day. Converted to modern measurements, that's roughly 600 to 700 milliliters of uncooked rice, which, when cooked into rice or porridge, isn't a small amount. But the problem was, regulations were regulations, and implementation was implementation. From imperial allocations to local yamens, and then from yamens to prisons, a portion of the rations would be skimmed off at each level. This was an unspoken practice within the ancient administrative system. By the time it reached your bowl, the originally sufficient rations might only be half left. However, in the Ming dynasty, some prisoners even had the chance to drink alcohol in prison. This alcohol was secretly brought in by jailers. Alcohol could both dull physical discomfort and serve as a gift in social interactions among prisoners. Some prisoners used alcohol to bribe others to help with tasks or to secure a better sleeping spot. You carried the bowl of porridge and carefully walked back to your corner. The porridge wasn't hot. You took a sip. It was bland and tasteless, but at least it was wet, warm, and swallowable. The grains of rice floated sparsely in the grayish-white liquid, almost countable on one hand. A fellow inmate next to you glanced at you and quietly said, "Save the biscuit. Eat it if you get hungry in the middle of the night." You nodded and tucked the dark biscuit into your sleeve. It was completely dark now. The palm-sized window now let in only a sliver of moonlight, as if someone had pasted a silver stamp on the wall. The temperature in the cell began to drop. You felt the walls radiating a bone-chilling cold. You couldn't help but shiver. How was I going to sleep tonight? Looking around, the layer of straw on the ground was your entire bedding. No bed, no blanket, no pillow. You tried to lie down. The straw felt harder than you imagined. It had been pressed down and compacted, losing the fluffiness and elasticity of fresh straw, more like a thin shell of grass. Through the layer of straw, you could clearly feel the ground beneath, cold, slightly damp earth. You turned over, and your right hip bone rested on the ground. You changed position, and your shoulder rested on it again. Moreover, the cell space was too small. 4 or 5 people lived in a 10-square-meter cell, after deducting the footprint of the pottery latrine and the necessary walking space. The space left for each person to sleep was probably only about half a body's width. When you turned over, you'd touch the person next to you. When they turned over, they'd touch you. At such close quarters, you could hear everyone's breathing and the grinding of teeth. Actually, some Tang Dynasty regulations mentioned that prisoners should be issued mats and cushions in winter, but whether these regulations were seriously implemented was another matter entirely. By the Song Dynasty, some local officials would issue old padded clothes to prisoners in winter. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, prisons in some large cities had relatively better conditions, but in remote areas, come winter, a dozen thinly clothed people would huddle in a small room, with knife-like cold wind pouring in through the window hole. The damp cold from the ground seeped up from beneath the straw. Some prisoners would unconsciously huddle together for warmth, like a pack of wild dogs embracing in the bitter cold, letting go of all their defenses and sense of distance, just to borrow a sliver of warmth from another similarly shivering body. You curled up on the straw, pulling your outer garment tighter around you. Next to you, the low, steady breathing of a fellow inmate could be heard. Someone was already asleep. You closed your eyes, trying not to think too much. But in the darkness and silence, your thoughts instead raced like an unbridled horse. You began to think of home, of your bed, which, though not great, at least had a quilt, of the steam from the hot porridge on the stove, of the crooked-necked jujube tree outside your door. You discovered that the cell had a unique ability. It didn't just confine your body, it would slowly infiltrate your spirit. During the day, you could still pass the time by conversing sporadically with fellow inmates and observing the changing light through the window hole. But at night, when everyone fell silent, and it was just you and yourself, that feeling of being trapped would creep up like a rising tide. Days passed, and your body began to protest. First, a constant hunger, then your skin. The damp straw and stuffy cell caused patches of red rash to erupt on your back and arms. A dry, hacking cough that seemed to emerge from deep within your throat, especially severe at night. Almost everyone in the cell was coughing, at different frequencies but similar rhythms. The oldest fellow inmate across from you coughed the longest. His cough had changed from dry to wet with phlegm, and sometimes he would bend into an arc during a violent fit of coughing. Ancient prisons were breeding grounds for disease. Confined spaces, poor ventilation, crowded populations, unclean drinking water, malnourished bodies. Add these factors together, and it was hard not to get sick. So what if you really got sick? If you were lucky, your family could bring in some herbal medicine through the jailer. If you were unlucky and had no money, you could only endure it. However, some dynasties were compassionate towards sick prisoners. There was once a law in the Song dynasty stating that if a prisoner became seriously ill in jail, the yamen had an obligation to summon a doctor to examine them. This regulation was further emphasized during the reign of Emperor Renzong of Song, when the imperial court even specifically allocated funds for prison medical expenses. But like many good systems, its implementation was greatly reduced. You sat leaning against the wall and coughed again. The old man across from you also coughed, as if in response. You thought, perhaps in a place like this, coughing was also a way of greeting. The old man looked at you and said something in a hoarse voice, like sandpaper rubbing wood. It's like this when you first come in. Endure the first 2 months and you'll be fine. You nodded, saying nothing. After a while longer, you began to notice a pattern. Every few days, someone would be taken out of the cell and never return. Sometimes they were released, sometimes transferred, but other times, no one could say for sure. Your fellow inmates' reactions to this were surprisingly calm, like seeing a neighbor move away. He's gone, they might say, and then everyone continued with their own lives. This calmness wasn't heartlessness, but a self-generated protective mechanism in an extreme environment. You couldn't invest too much emotion in everyone's departure, because your emotional reserves in this place, like your physical strength, were limited. Once consumed, there was nothing left. One morning, an unusual set of footsteps echoed down the corridor. It wasn't the leisurely pace of the jailers, but several pairs of feet hurrying along. Amidst them was the figure of a woman. One of your fellow inmates suddenly looked up, his eyes flashing with a light you hadn't seen on anyone's face since your imprisonment. "It's my wife," he whispered, his voice trembling. In ancient China, prison visits did indeed exist, and many dynasties had clear legal bases for them. Tang dynasty law permitted direct relatives of prisoners to visit periodically, but with strict time and procedural limitations. You couldn't just show up whenever you wanted. You had to report to the yamen first, get approval, and then conduct the visit at a specified time and location. The entire process was supervised by a jailer. You couldn't secretly pass items, and you couldn't talk for too long. When family members arrived at the yamen, they first had to bribe the bailiffs at the entrance before being led to the prison. At the prison gate, they had to bribe the gatekeeping jailers again. Once inside, upon seeing the jailer in charge of your particular cell, you'd have to bribe them yet again. If your family didn't understand this routine, or simply couldn't produce the money, they'd have to wait idly outside the yamen gate and might not see you even by nightfall. Your fellow inmate stood at the bars, his wife appearing in the corridor. The two exchanged a few words through the wooden bars, their voices kept low, with the jailer watching nearby. His wife handed over a cloth bundle, likely containing clothes and food. The jailer took it, opened it in front of them both, and rummaged through it. He took away some item, probably a hard object not allowed inside, then handed the rest to your fellow inmate. The entire process took no longer than the time it takes to brew a cup of tea, and then the jailer began to rush them. All right, time's up." His wife's eyes reddened, but she didn't cry. Your fellow inmate said nothing either, just tightly clutched the cloth bundle, watching her back disappear at the end of the corridor. In the Song dynasty, there was a system called temporary release. It allowed some light offenders to temporarily leave prison and return home under family guarantee, on the condition that they must return on time to conclude their leave. This sounded very humane, but in practice, temporary release often became a privilege for those with money and connections. You had to be able to provide sufficient bail money and also have someone in official circles to speak on your behalf. Ordinary commoners, even if they committed the smallest crime, would find it difficult to enjoy this treatment. Your fellow inmate sat back in his corner, opened the cloth bundle. Inside were a clean padded jacket and a few biscuits. He hugged the padded jacket to his chest and smelled it. You guessed the padded jacket probably still carried the scent of his home, sunlight, the stove, or some kind of everyday aroma you'd never smell again in this cell. His eyes reddened for a moment, but quickly returned to normal. He was silent for a while, then broke a biscuit in half and offered one half to the person next to him. That person took it, nodded, and didn't say thank you. In prison, if you gave someone food, they owed you a favor. Next time you needed help, For example, if you needed to get up to use the latrine in the middle of the night and asked others to make room, or if you got into an argument with other prisoners and needed someone on your side, that favor could be called in. You slowly began to understand that every action in prison had a dual meaning, like two sides of a coin. You had been in jail for about half a month. You couldn't say precisely, because there was no calendar. You could only roughly estimate by observing the changing light from the small window hole. In these half a month, you had, without formal instruction, figured out the internal social structure of the cell. It was more complex than you imagined, with an unwritten set of rules that everyone adhered to. The hierarchy in the cell was primarily determined by who arrived first. The earliest occupants of the cell held the most sway. They occupied the best spots, usually closest to the window hole. The light was slightly better, as was the ventilation. Later arrivals could only successively move to less desirable positions. You were the last to arrive, so your spot was in the corner closest to that pottery latrine, and next was the crime. Although legally a prisoner was just a prisoner, in the informal society of the cell, what you were arrested for directly influenced how others treated you. Thieves were looked down upon, but at least they were harmless. Debtors were pitied, because anyone could face that situation someday. Brawlers had to be treated carefully, because you didn't know if they would also resort to violence in the cell. As for those involved in grave crimes, other prisoners had a complex attitude towards them, both in awe and wary, somewhat like watching a tiger in a zoo. Finally, and most importantly, money. Wealthy individuals in the cell, even if they only had a few dozen copper coins more than others, could enjoy special treatment. Rich prisoners could obtain better food through the jailers, and this food would sometimes be shared with others, thereby establishing a patronage relationship. In some large prisons during the Qing dynasty, a role similar to a Liutu, prison boss, even emerged among prisoners. Such people were not officially appointed, but naturally arose during long periods of incarceration. The Liutu was usually the prisoner who had been in custody the longest, understood the rules best, and had the best relationship with the jailers. He served as a manager within the cell, assigning spots, mediating disputes, and even maintaining order on behalf of the jailers. Some jailers were happy to cultivate such Liutu, as it greatly reduced their management burden. Naturally, the Liutu also benefited from this role. He could extract a portion of resources from other prisoners, enjoy more space, and sometimes even influence the jailer's decisions on certain matters. You quickly learned to find your place in this miniature society. Don't stick out, don't fall behind, follow the right people, and talk less. These four were the most fundamental survival wisdom in prison. The point about talking less was especially crucial. The cell was an extremely information-sensitive space. Every word you spoke could be heard by others, remembered by others, and then used against you at some unexpected moment. Some prisoners would intentionally or unintentionally try to pry information from you during casual chats. What's your case about? Who else is in your family? Who do you have grudges with? Such information sometimes served as currency in jail, which could be used to exchange for favors with jailers or to betray you during interrogations. So you learned a special way of chatting. Say a lot, but nothing important. Talk about the weather, about food, about prices outside, about a certain jailer's temperament. Anything could be discussed, just not your own case. In your third week of imprisonment, a small commotion came from the other end of the cell block. A new prisoner was being brought in. But this time was different. The bailiffs led the new prisoner to the other end of the corridor and pushed them into a cell you had never seen anyone enter or exit before. You peered through the gaps in the bars. You vaguely saw a thin, small figure. Your fellow inmate next to you whispered, "A woman?" In ancient China, female prisoners were detained separately from males. Female prisoners were held in separate areas, guarded by specialized personnel. But separate detention, while solving the problem of mixing genders, couldn't resolve deeper predicaments. Firstly, the physical conditions of the cells were unfriendly to all prisoners, but female prisoners also faced additional difficulties, such as a complete lack of sanitary products during menstruation and extreme scarcity of clean clothes. These seemingly minor issues were magnified into immense suffering during daily prison life. The greater problem was at the societal level. In ancient China's moral system, a woman being imprisoned was itself a grave stigma. No matter what crime you committed, no matter whether you were ultimately found guilty or innocent, as long as you had been in jail, your social reputation was basically ruined. For male prisoners, although they would also face discrimination after release, there was at least a possibility of rebuilding their lives. For female prisoners, release often meant being abandoned by their families, repudiated by their husbands, and completely marginalized within their communities. Some female prisoners already knew during their wait for trial that, regardless of the outcome, their lives could never go back to what they were. In some recorded cases from the Ming and Qing dynasties, there were even women who chose extreme measures out of fear of the social consequences of imprisonment. They preferred to end everything before being arrested, rather than endure the humiliation and discrimination that came with entering prison. This was not a legal problem, but a tragedy caused by societal perceptions as a whole. The Qing dynasty actually had a practice called shu, redemption. This system was then considered a special favor, as it preserved a woman's reputation. But from another perspective, this also precisely illustrated society's attitude towards women being imprisoned at that time. It wasn't an ordinary legal consequence, but a social punishment more severe than the penal code itself. You couldn't quite make out the female prisoner's face, nor did you know why she had been arrested. You only saw her pushed into the cell, then sitting quietly in the corner, unmoving, like a forgotten statue. Silence returned to the corridor, as if nothing had happened. You started counting the days. You scratched marks on the pounded earth wall with your fingernail, one scratch for each day that passed. By the time you reached the 40th mark, 2 of your fingernails had split, and there was still no news about your case. No one came to interrogate you, no one told you how far your case had progressed, and no one gave you even a vague timeline. Among all the sufferings in ancient prisons, waiting was perhaps the most tormenting. Hunger you could endure, cold you could bear, even crowding and stench you could slowly adapt to. But waiting would slowly gnaw away at your spirit. From initial anxiety, you slowly became numb, and then slowly, it turned into a strange acceptance. You began to develop some peculiar habits to fill the time. You observed the angle of light from the window hole, judging roughly what time of day it was. You counted the blades of straw, from one end to the other, and then back again. In your mind, you recited the few poems you had learned as a child, over and over again, until each word lost its meaning and became pure phonemes. You even started talking to the cracks on the wall. In ancient Chinese judicial practice, the delay in case hearings was an extremely common problem, with multiple reasons. Firstly, ancient local officials usually held multiple positions. The county magistrate had to manage administration, taxation, water conservancy, disaster relief, and also justice. Hearing cases was only one part of his job, sometimes even the lowest priority. Encountering a busy or not particularly diligent county official, your case could be shelved for several months. Secondly, ancient criminal judicial procedures themselves were relatively complex. Some cases involving public interest, after being reviewed at the county level, still had to be reported to the prefecture or provincial level for endorsement, and even more significant ones had to be reported to the Ministry of Justice, or even the Emperor for judgment. This process of hierarchical reporting and approval was extremely lengthy. In an era where both transportation and communication were extremely slow, the mere transmission of documents between various yamens could take weeks or even months. Some case delays weren't even due to procedure, but personal connections. In cases involving powerful and influential people, local officials might deliberately delay judgment, waiting for instructions from above. In difficult and complex cases, local officials might also choose to shelve them indefinitely, fearing incorrect judgments. There was an even more absurd situation. A local official was transferred, and the newly appointed official wasn't interested in the cases left by their predecessor, piling them in a corner and ignoring them. When the next official arrived, they'd find the dust on the case files thicker than the files themselves, and so they'd continue to ignore them. This way, from one official to the next, cases remained, and prisoners remained, but the connection between the two had grown increasingly tenuous. For prisoners in jail, the most terrifying thing wasn't being sentenced to a certain punishment, but not even having the chance to be sentenced. After almost 2 months in jail, one day, a new fellow inmate arrived in your cell. During a casual chat, you complained to him about the cell's conditions. Who knew he would tell you, "You're actually lucky. I have a relative who is in the Dali Temple prison in the capital." Now that was miserable. In ancient China, the hierarchy of prisons was linked to the hierarchy of government offices. You were currently in a county-level prison, conditions were poor, but at least the management was relatively lax because the county yaman's main focus wasn't on the prison. But if your case was large enough, serious enough, or involved enough people, you might be transferred to a prefecture level or even a capital city prison. Prisons in the capital, such as the Dali Temple prison in the Tang dynasty, the Ministry of Justice's main prison in the Ming dynasty, or the Jin Yue's imperial prison, were entirely different worlds. The Dali Temple held the nation's most important criminals. If you were a local official awaiting review, you might still enjoy some dignity. But if you were a suspect in a major case, what awaited you might be tighter surveillance, more frequent interrogations, and greater psychological pressure. By the Ming dynasty, the Jin Yue's imperial prison made people turn pale at the mention of it. It was not under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Justice, nor the Dali Temple, but answered directly to the emperor. The very existence of the imperial prison operated outside the normal judicial system. Those incarcerated there did not follow regular trial procedures. When they were released or how they were sentenced depended entirely on the emperor's will. This uncertainty itself was a form of psychological oppression. However, not all higher-level prisons were worse than county-level ones. Records from the Song dynasty show that some official prisons housing officials or aristocrats had quite good conditions, with specialized food provisions, relatively spacious areas, and even books available for reading. In the Tang dynasty, there was also a special form of imprisonment called Jingu, house arrest, applied to imperial family members who had broken oaths. They were usually not confined in ordinary prisons, but rather placed under house arrest in a certain residence or temple. Their living conditions might even be better than many free people, but they were not allowed to leave or see visitors. Essentially, it was a gilded cage. Some imperial family members remained under such house arrest for decades until they were forgotten. You silently looked at your surroundings, damp, dark, crowded, crude. But at least here, no one cared who you were, and your case wasn't significant enough to alarm the capital. Perhaps, in some strange sense, this truly counted as good luck. In ancient times, the meaning of the word fairness was not quite what you might think. Even for committing the same crime, a wealthy merchant could eat hot meals and sleep on dry bedding in jail. A poor person couldn't even get a full bowl of porridge. Similarly, when detained, a fallen official could read and write in jail, awaiting reinstatement, while an ordinary commoner could only count straw blades in the darkness, awaiting an unknown destiny. When written on paper, the law didn't differentiate between rich and poor, but when applied in reality, it would automatically match different treatments according to your status and financial means. You in this small cell felt this unfairness with your own body. It wasn't caused by any single person, nor was it a flaw in any single system. It was more like something permeating the very air of society. You couldn't grasp it, nor could you resist it. You could only breathe it in and continue to live. Around the 70th day, one of your fellow inmates disappeared. Not released, not transferred, but in the dead of night, he had climbed over the pounded earth wall behind the cell, somehow loosened a few bricks, and slipped out. The next morning, when the jailers came to check, they found one missing, and the entire prison erupted into chaos. Escaping was a thought every prisoner in ancient jails had, but most never dared to act upon. Although ancient prison walls were made of pounded earth or brick, they were usually very thick. Moreover, cells were typically in the core area of the prison. Even if you scaled the cell wall, there was still the prison's main perimeter wall outside, and beyond that, the yaman's courtyard wall, layer upon layer. Not to mention the jailers patrolling at night. Any slight movement could lead to discovery. Furthermore, the consequences of escape were extremely severe. In the Tang dynasty, jailbreaking was a separate crime. Regardless of your original crime, if you were caught after escaping, the original crime plus the escape crime would be handled together, resulting in aggravated punishment. If you were originally imprisoned for merely stealing a few bolts of cloth, you might have just received a few dozen blows with a rod and been done with it. But once you escaped, the nature of your offense completely changed. You transformed from a petty thief into a serious offender who defied national law. Even worse was the system of collective punishment. If you ran, it wasn't just your problem. The prisoners in your same cell, the jailers responsible for guarding you, and even the chief official of the entire prison could all be implicated because of your escape. Under the collective punishment system, jailers had extremely strong motivation to catch you and bring you back. However, there were indeed successful escape cases throughout history. Some were due to natural disasters, such as earthquakes toppling prison walls, allowing prisoners to escape amidst the chaos. Some were due to wartime chaos. When enemy forces attacked a city, prison order collapsed and prisoners scattered. And a very small number were meticulously planned, taking advantage of jailers' negligence or corruption. But these successful cases were recorded precisely because they were rare enough to be noteworthy. The third day's morning, your disappeared fellow inmate was brought back. His shoes were gone, his face had several obvious scrapes, and his clothes were covered in dirt and grass. He just sat there, his eyes fixed on that palm-sized window hole, as if that small square of sky owed him something. You noticed his fingers trembling slightly, perhaps from having been exposed to the cold outside for the past few days. You turned your head away, pretending not to see. A moment later, you silently pulled out half of your saved dark biscuit from your sleeve, placed it on the ground beside him, and continued staring at the opposite wall. He didn't speak, but you heard him pick up the biscuit and take a bite. After who knows how many more days, a jailer's voice echoed down the corridor, a few decibels louder than usual. Great amnesty! The Emperor has proclaimed a great amnesty for all under heaven. The entire prison area instantly erupted. Figures emerged from behind the bars of all the cells, chattering excitedly, asking, "What kind of amnesty? When was the imperial decree issued? What crimes are covered by the pardon?" Your heart also gave a sudden leap. Great amnesty for all under heaven. It meant the emperor was in a good mood, perhaps due to his ascension to the throne, the investiture of a crown prince, the appearance of auspicious omens, or celebrations after the end of a natural disaster. In short, the emperor felt that everyone should celebrate, so he grandly waved his hand and pardoned prisoners across the land. But your excitement came quickly and subsided just as fast, because you immediately realized that a general amnesty wasn't a complete pardon. There were different levels of amnesty. The broadest was a great amnesty for all under heaven, theoretically covering all prisoners. The next level was regional amnesty, referring to the pardon of prisoners in specific areas. Below that was grade reduction, not a pardon, but a reduction of everyone's punishment by 1 degree. But even the broadest great amnesty for all under heaven came with a whole host of exceptions. In the Tang dynasty, general amnesties usually explicitly listed crimes not covered by the pardon. Grave crimes such as rebellion, treason, and conspiracy to rebel were almost always unpardonable, and some specific types of crimes were also frequently excluded. This meant that after the imperial decree of amnesty was read aloud, a cruel dividing line would appear in the prison. Some people joyfully prepared to leave, while for others, nothing would change. They would remain in their original spots, only now with a lot more empty space around them. You listened carefully to the jailer reading the content of the imperial decree. He stammered through it, most likely because it had just been passed down from above, and he hadn't fully understood it himself. Then you began to compare your own crime in your mind. The result left you unable to say whether you were happy or disappointed. Your crime happened to be on the border of the amnesty's scope, belonging to that gray area where it might or might not be pardoned. You had to wait for the Yaman's final confirmation, more waiting. But this wait was more tormenting than the previous ones. Because before, you had waited in complete darkness, with no hope and no disappointment, and your mindset was stable. Now you saw a sliver of light, and this sliver of light caused your heart to swing wildly. One of your fellow inmates had already confirmed he was within the amnesty's scope. His shoulders instantly relaxed, and his breathing softened. Even the grayish-white pallor on his face seemed to have faded a little. You watched him, a mix of emotions in your heart. Finally, about 3 months after your imprisonment, the scratches on the wall were so dense that you couldn't count them yourself anymore. The bailiff opened the barred door and said, "Go on, you can leave now." You stood up, your legs feeling a little weak. You looked down at yourself. Your clothes were so dirty you couldn't discern their original color. You had lost at least a size, and your fingernails were packed with the dust from the pounded earth wall. You walked down the corridor, past other cells. Some people looked up at you, their eyes holding something indescribable. Perhaps envy, perhaps indifference, or perhaps just a habitual glance at someone passing by. You passed through that ironclad door. Its hinge, as usual, groaned like an old ox. Then you stood in the Yaman's backyard, sunlight hitting your face. You closed your eyes for a moment. It was too bright. 3 months. You had almost forgotten what sunlight looked like. You were finally out of prison. What then? While in prison, all your energy was focused on how to survive until you got out. But only after you truly came out did you discover that the outside world no longer quite welcomed you. You had been imprisoned for 3 months. Your previous anonymity was long gone. You had to start from scratch. Moreover, in ancient society, which was based on personal connections, having been to jail was a label almost impossible to wash off. Your neighbors knew you had been imprisoned. When you tried to do business, people wouldn't trust you. Families with daughters to marry would steer clear of you. No matter what crime you originally committed, or even if you were wrongly accused, the mere fact of having been imprisoned had already branded you. Some released prisoners would choose to leave their hometowns and start anew in a place where no one knew them. But under the ancient household registration system, such an escape was itself illegal. You had to live in your original locality. Unauthorized relocation would incur punishment. You were trapped in an invisible net. Your time in jail was done, but the identity of a prisoner you might carry for a lifetime. You walked down the street, your legs still a little weak. After only a few steps, you wanted to stop and rest. Passers-by occasionally gave you a second glance. Your appearance was too obvious. Gaunt, pale, ragged. Anyone could tell at a glance where you had come from. You felt those gazes prick your back like small needles. You instinctively wanted to walk faster, but your body wouldn't obey. 3 months of prison life had left deeper marks on you than you realized. It wasn't merely losing a size. Your muscles had atrophied, your reactions had slowed, and your eyes, accustomed to dim light, now involuntarily squinted when exposed to sunlight. You looked like someone who had returned from another world. You stood on the street in front of the Yaman gate, the sunlight dazzling, the crowd bustling. You should have felt relieved, but you found your steps a little hesitant. To the left was the road home. To the right, the official road leading out of the city. You stood there for a while, watching the people coming and going on the street. Flatbread vendors, donkey cart drivers, women holding babies, scholars carrying their books, each one busy with their own affairs, no one giving you a second glance. You had once been one of these people, walking on the same road, breathing the same air, feeling that everything was as it should be. Now you stood here, 3 months later, feeling that everything before your eyes was both familiar and strange, like a scene you had seen in a dream but couldn't quite fully recall upon waking. Then, you took a deep breath and took your first step. Whether left or right, no matter what awaited you, at least you were walking again. Your feet trod on solid ground, not the damp, trampled earth of the prison cell, but a wide, bright road leading into the distance.